Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for attending TalentQuest's webinar on using interviews to determine whether potential employees are a culture match. My name is Dina Kwasik, and I am a member of the communications team here at TalentQuest. We're excited to spend the next hour with you discussing interviews and potential employees. Just a few housekeeping notes. After the presentation, we will have time for a brief question and answer session. Please send your questions via the question box that appears at the top right of your screen. Also, after the webinar, we will forward a copy of the presentation as well as a recording to everyone. Our presenter today is Adrianne McVeigh, Executive Director of Assessment Solutions here at TalentQuest. Adrianne is a business psychologist with over 7 years of experience as a consultant in the talent management space. She has some great information to share with you today, so I'd like to welcome Adrianne and turn the presentation over to her.
Okay, so we're ready to get started. Thank you so much for your patience. And we're going to make this worth your while. Today we're talking about culture, and the title of our webinar today is Fit or Flop, how we can use interviews to determine whether potential employees, candidates, are a culture match for the organization. And I'm very excited to be with you today. Culture fit is a pretty big topic. It's a broad topic, and it's difficult to cover it as it deserves to be covered in 45 minutes, but we're going to do our best, and knowing that we can't quite meet that expectation, I'm certainly open to answering any questions or things that come up after this webinar is over. So thank you so much. Okay, so these pictures show you the analogy that I use to explain the importance of culture fit. It's that of a swimmer diving from a tall diving board into a pool below. And I think when someone is truly a culture fit for an organization, their entry into that company can be pretty graceful and quite seamless. They're sort of like an Olympic diver, and their form, their placement is perfect. They disappear into the water with barely a ripple. On the opposite end of the spectrum, when someone is not a culture fit, it's quite a different story. Their entrance into the organization is much like a big old belly flop. It's painful for them, it's awkward and painful for others to be around and to witness, and it also creates a splash that disrupts nearly everyone in the vicinity. So I think by paying attention to culture fit, you can really ensure a more seamless transition of new candidates into your company rather than the painful and embarrassing belly flop. You can truly get it right the first time if you pay enough attention to the process. Okay, so what's on our agenda for today? We're going to talk a little bit about the basics. What is culture? Why does it matter? Make the case for its importance and why you should make it a big part of your interview process and determining and sort of your decision-making process. And then we're going to talk about what you specifically can do at each step of the way to determine culture fit. So before the interview, we're going to talk about things like your preparation, the process, the interview process you create, the competencies that you're going to explore during the interview. During the interview, we'll talk about things like creating behavioral interview questions and how to do really good follow-up. And after the interview, we're going to cover things like the debrief, how to score and evaluate the answers that you get from candidates, and how to communicate to the candidates about the results. All right, so here's a good question. What is culture? Culture is simply the values and behaviors that contribute to the unique social and psychological environment of an organization, almost like each organization's personality. And Herb Kelleher, who's the chairman of Southwest Airlines, which has its own very unique culture, says he says culture is what people do when no one is looking. It's also been described as simply how we do things around here. And I have here sort of a model of some of the things that contribute to organizational culture. First of all, we have leadership. I think culture is very much influenced from the top down in terms of what the leader says and does. Are they walking the walk and talking the talk? Culture is also very much influenced by shared beliefs and assumptions, by the values that are important to the company and to its key people, by the norms and practices, simply how things get done, and by measures of success. So what do people actually get rewarded for, and what do people get punished for, so to speak, in an organization? All of those things taken together create what an organizational culture is. And some companies do this in a very purposeful and thoughtful way, and some don't. But no matter what the case is, you have a culture. So it would be great to have one that is purposeful and thoughtful, because your culture is very much part of your brand. So here's some examples of some organizational cultures that exist out there. Zappos, for example, is one that I'll talk even a little bit more about in a moment. But they are very well known for their culture, and actually even have culture workshops, 2 or 3 day workshops now, where they put people through a chance to learn more about creating an organizational culture and learning more about Zappos culture. Wegmans, for example, is a company that really relies on customer service and keeping customers happy, and they really want to do this in a careful and calculated way. So when they only open a few new stores every year, and they send their best employees to those new locations to make sure they're set up properly. They spend millions of dollars training people so that everyone feels fully trained, ready to work, and each new opening is sort of an example of what their culture is, as opposed to some haphazard last minute thing. Netflix is another culture that has taken time. The organization has taken much time to define their culture, and they have 5 tenets that drive their culture. Overall, it's a very high performance culture, and the way they describe their tenets is interesting. One of them is, we only hire, reward, and tolerate fully formed adults. Got a little sarcasm in there, which I like. So they really choose to simplify their policies. They grew very quickly, and instead of making things more complicated or more structured as they grew, they took the approach of, let's simplify wherever we can. So instead of having a complicated expense policy, they said, the expense policy is you should act in Netflix's best interest. Instead of having a paid vacation and time off policy, they said simply take time whenever you need it, and whatever you deem appropriate. The focus is on, as long as you're getting results and you're getting things done, then you should be trusted to be an adult and make the right decision about what time to take off. They also believe that it's important to tell the truth about performance. So they've actually eliminated formal reviews, and they feel like conversations about performance should be an organic part of your work, and they train their managers to have more consistent and frequent, and in some ways more casual conversations about performance and where they're at. Another company that I have on here is Southwest Airlines. So they're kind of a company that believes in fun, and I have an example later of how they sort of use their folks in the interview process. Google's also a well-known culture, and they call each other Googlers and spend 20% of their time they're allowed to spend on ideas that are of their own choosing. And so that, I think, promotes a culture of innovation, creativity, and opportunity, which I think is very important to them. So Zappos, I mentioned as sort of a highlight. They really are one of the leaders in terms of defining a true and positive organizational culture, and putting that out there. Tony, who's the CEO of Zappos, says, your culture is your brand. And he takes it very seriously and has really promoted this within the organization. And he says, we've actually said no to a lot of very talented people because we know, even though they can immediately impact our bottom line, they were not culture fits. And Zappos was willing to sacrifice the short-term benefits in order to protect their culture and therefore their brand for the long term. So these values here that they outline, 1 through 10, kind of give you a sense of Zappos culture. And if you look at the language, you get a feel for it. Create fun and a little weirdness. Build a positive team and a family spirit, that collaboration, that creativity from number 3. Be passionate and determined. 10, be humble. So they're not looking for the top star from some other team that's going to come in with a big ego. They're looking for someone who can really be part of the Zappos family and also really focus on service. Zappos is actually also known, if any of you have ordered shoes from there, I will say that I have. It's a great company. Instead of like some other customer service operations, they don't get measured on how many calls they take or the the volume of calls. They actually get measured. A successful call is a long call, one where they've spent time handling the customer's issues and making sure they're very happy. And they're really encouraged to do everything they can to make that customer happy. Okay, so why does culture matter? I'm going to make the case that many companies make the mistake of hiring primarily based on competence and not paying enough attention to cultural fit. And there's actually a recent meta-analysis that looked at employees who fit well within their organization, and those employees had more job satisfaction, they identified more with their company, they were more likely to remain with the organization, they were more committed, they showed superior job performance. And so a lot of studies have shown increased engagement, better results, easier recruiting, retention, all these things that I'm showing you here on the screen. So I think that it matters for a number of reasons because it has a positive impact if you have a culture fit across the board. And there's also been studies of cultural fit in other countries that have shown a relationship between cultural fit and mental and physical health. So if your job fits your personality, you're less likely to exhibit signs of depression, anxiety, and the like. So I think it's a win-win for everyone across the board if you can get this right. So another statistic from our friends at Roundpeg, who focus specifically on culture and culture fit, and I think this is one that can be surprising to people. 89% of an employee's success is based on cultural fit, the fit between them and the organization they join. Only 11% is skills and experience. So that sort of makes the case right there for the importance of focusing on culture fit. You can poach a star from another company or your competitor, and they're not necessarily going to be the same shining star when they join an organization with a very different culture. You need to have a culture that's a fit in order for an individual to truly be their best self and the best employee that they possibly can be. Culture also very much impacts turnover, and turnover costs money. So the bottom line is that companies that have a positive culture and one where employees are a culture fit tend to have about 14.9% turnover. This is a Columbia University study. And companies with a poor culture and a poor culture fit between organization and employee had 48.4% turnover. Big difference, very big difference. And I think if you can reduce that by even a little bit by paying more attention, then you can reduce your costs, your unnecessary costs of turnover by a great deal. Culture and culture fit also has an impact on how happy employees are. And happy employees, as the entrepreneur.com study says, outperform the competition by 20%. I also found some data that employees at Sears stores that saw an increase in employee happiness saw a 5% rise in revenue. So employees that are culture fit not only are happier, but they also contribute to the bottom line. And finally, one more stat to make the case. There was a poll conducted in 2013 of 150,000 workers that showed that approximately 70% hated their jobs or felt disengaged. That's rather depressing. But the reasons for their disengagement were very interesting. One, poor management. So I'm sure you've all heard people don't leave jobs, people leave people. They leave the bad manager or the horrible coworker that's causing them problems every day. So that's a given. We know that. But number two is poor cultural fit. So one of the biggest reasons people leave is they simply don't fit in a culture. They know they're not feeling successful. Things are kind of in their way, and they're not able to show their skills in a way that they know they possibly can or have in the past. And so they move on to greener pastures where they might be able to have more success. All right, so we're going to talk about what we can do before the interview even happens to sort of get prepared and make sure that we are going about this assessment of cultural fit in the best possible way. Okay, well, this is a gimme, but first of all, you have to identify what your culture is. What is important? For the role, yes, you have to know what's important for the role, but also for the culture that you're bringing that person into. And that culture tends to be organization-wide, although there are some team cultures that exist too as well, or subcultures we could call them. So you have to ask yourself the questions such as this: what are your organization's values? And challenge yourself to ask, how would you describe your culture in a few sentences? You have to think about what people have been successful here up until this point, what type of people have not, and try and define that as best as you can. And you also need to map that out as clearly as you can, so you know what leads to success, what leads to failure, and then you can evaluate and assess a candidate's culture fit in a more objective and purposeful manner rather than playing a guessing game. The other important point is you have to decide if you're hiring for the culture that you have or the culture that you want, because those are not always the same thing. In this example here, I have two types of organizations, maybe a sales organization where some of the things that would be important to that culture and to success in that culture would be things like assertiveness, a competitive nature, a certain level of autonomy, because a lot of the folks have to be out on their own in order to be productive and successful, an outgoing nature because it involves a lot of business development and such. Or maybe you have a startup whose culture is very much about being creative and innovative. People have to be risk takers. They have to be collaborative and willing to play a lot of different roles because money is tight and you can only hire a certain number of people until you see real success. And also work ethic in that startup, perhaps. There might be flexibility, but you might be expected to work nights and weekends for a few weeks in order to get some additional venture capital, etc. So things to think about. The other thing that I think you can do is to make sure that you're funneling the right candidates to yourself or to your organization. You need to find a way to communicate what your culture is in as transparent a way as possible, and as clear as possible in as many ways or mediums as possible. So offer a really explicit description of the culture and values. When you list your job requirements, try and use language that mirrors certain values that you have, like collaborate or produce results on. And when you're listing candidate qualifications, think about specifically what you're seeking: someone who's entrepreneurial, someone who's flexible, etc. You also want to think about where are you posting these job opportunities, and pick places where you're more likely to find the types of people that will be a culture fit. So here's a great example that a colleague of mine came across, and I thought it was wonderful, and that is it's a job description for Director of Apple Awesomeness in Greenville, South Carolina. And this job description, you can see just the title alone kind of gives it a feel for what the culture's like. And they start off the description by saying, do you believe The Anchorman was one of the greatest movies of our generation? Do you secretly not turn the channel when reruns of Fresh Prince come on? So they have a serious sense of humor. And I think this simply shows a company that's wearing its culture on its sleeve and is more likely to attract people that are going to fit. So people that resonate with this sort of description are going to be more likely to apply. And it's just fun. I mean, I actually want to move to Greenville now and potentially gain some experience in IT. Okay, so I think the next thing you got to keep in mind when it comes to interviewing and culture fit is it is definitely a two-way street. And it is not just the candidate being interviewed. You need to think about what is it that you want to highlight about your company and create a process that reflects your culture at every step. Ask yourself, what sort of experience or feeling do you want candidates to walk away with? I have a great example. That's coming up soon, I suppose. Yeah, okay. Establish the process. So who is going to participate in the interview? What sort of questions are they going to ask? How are you going to debrief? And now for the first one there, who's going to participate? I often recommend having as many members of the team as possible participate in the interview, because you want to both have everyone weigh in on this decision, and everyone's going to see something a little bit different that they can bring to the table when they debrief. But also, and that gives the candidate the opportunity to meet as many people as they can and be able to make the assessment on their end of whether they're a fit. Am I going to jive with these folks? Are we going to be able to collaborate together and communicate together? Also, what questions will each of them ask? I've certainly heard about interviews where the candidate goes through and 5 or 6 people ask them the same questions over and over. Think about what the experience is like for that candidate once they get to the end of that day. It sounds miserable. How could you maybe organize it so that they each assess certain competencies, maybe with a different type of question? And how are you going to debrief those interviews? Probably the haphazard way that I've certainly heard of happening is maybe one person, the HR person, runs around saying, well, what'd you think of Billy? Well, what'd you think of Susan? You know, that has happened. Is that as effective as maybe coming together as a group and reviewing you know, the pros, the cons, some of the competencies that were required for success, and doing that in a more organized and thoughtful way? The latter is probably more effective. What other components are you going to include? So the interview is typical, we all know that, but I think there's some other components that might be very helpful. The casual interaction, if you're assessing culture fit, gives the opportunity for the candidate to be a little bit more laid back. There's no structure. You get to see, you know, over lunch, do they ask questions? Are they comfortable engaging others in conversation? Are they completely shell-shocked and have no idea what to say? Do they, you know, do they eat without their utensils? I mean, you know, who knows what you could find. So another option is to use some additional testing to look at various things, whether that's personality, communication style, maybe it's some specific skills, who knows. And simulation. We'll cover those a little bit more when we talk about some of the tools that might be helpful in assessment of culture fit. But really, I show a chocolate cake here, not just because I like chocolate cake, which I do, but because your focus on culture needs to be baked in. Get it baked in to every step of your process, so that you're evaluating it in the right way, and so that people are also walking away with an idea of what your culture is all about simply from their interview experience. Here is a little funny example of a company that has baked in their culture and personality into the interview process. So if anyone here has shopped at an IKEA before, I hope it wasn't on a weekend, bless you, but they ask the person to come in and make a chair before they take a seat for their interview, which is kind of hilarious. All right, so prepare. This might seem really obvious. You can make fun of me for that, but I think it's really a serious thing to make sure that you and everyone who's on your side of the interview process, if you're sort of organizing a group of people to interview this person, everyone needs to be prepared. Read the resume. We've all heard or maybe experienced an interview where you went in and it felt like they were reading your resume as they were interviewing you. And that doesn't feel good. That doesn't feel like they're invested and they care about you and they've done their research. So not a good feeling from that sort of interview. And prepare questions. Really think ahead of time, what competencies are we going to be focusing on? What are some good questions? I've read the resume. I want to follow up on these areas that I want to learn more about. All of that will help you out and help the candidate to feel more pursued and valued. And make sure that all of those interviewers that are part of the process are aligned and prepared, not only on when they're interviewing that person, but any materials that they need to review in advance, what questions they're going to be asking, how they're going to be expected to share the information when it's finished. And share an agenda. Consider putting together an agenda both for the individual coming in and for the interviewer, so they know what that person's day is like, and can potentially comment on that or refer to that. Okay, so during the interview, what are some things you can do? Here we have the CEO of Starbucks talking about hiring people is an art, not a science. Resumes can only tell you so much in terms of whether someone will fit into a culture or not. So we have the interview and some additional tools to help us with figuring the rest of it out. So some of the tools you can use in terms of determining culture fit. One is certainly competencies, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit more. And behavioral interview questions we'll go into some detail on those. Those are probably some of your biggest and most powerful tools in the toolbox. Another one that we've developed for clients are structured behavior interview and scoring guides, where we might take a specific department or critical role and identify what competencies are important, and then develop questions that get at those competencies and a scoring guide so that the interviewer can more objectively evaluate whether the answers were effective or ineffective. Personality assessment can be a great tool, and also culture profiles. And I'll give you a little bit more information on each of those. So competencies and values. Many of you probably have a competency model in your organization, and if you don't, it's a good idea to get one. But these are sort of the things that define what could lead to success in an organization. They help ensure that everyone's rowing in the same direction, sort of a foundation or map for success. And behavioral interview questions are questions designed to get at how candidates have demonstrated certain skills and competencies in the past. So it might be cliche, but it's been backed up by research that past behavior is actually the best predictor of future behavior. So in terms of behavioral interview questions, you need to determine what traits are critical, what are some of the company's values and core competencies. That helps you determine what should we be assessing, what should be focused on. Then you have to think about, if we know what the competencies are, or the traits or values that are really important to our company, when would you see something like that? When would you see someone actually using those traits or those competencies? In what sorts of situations? And that helps you determine what question you're going to ask. And then finally, how would that look if someone was being ineffective or effective at using that trait or value or competency? And that helps you determine how to evaluate the answer or how to score it. So before we give you some examples of behavioral interview questions, why even bother using them? First of all, they really help level the playing field between candidates. It helps make sure that your interviews focus on the right things, key factors for success in that job or in that culture. And structured interviews have shown to be more predictive of job success than unstructured interviews. They help make sure that your interviewers are more consistent, and they reduce the possibility of going off script too much and causing problems and going into a zone of possible discrimination. So let's see, are these good behavioral interview questions or not? The first one is a pretty darn common interview question. I'm not sure if it's a good one, but maybe more of a sort of softball question up front to get people a little bit more comfortable. Surely they're going to have an answer for that one. Tell me about yourself. It is not a behavioral interview question because it is not looking at having someone give you a story or an example from past behavior. Number two, how would you handle it if a customer became irate with you? That's an interesting question. It's actually asking people, though, to imagine how they would handle something. And we all know that when we're thinking about how we would do things, we sort of put a halo above our heads and think about how we could best possibly handle something. It's much easier to do that than to actually be in a situation and deal with it. So not usually where you're going to get the most genuine responses. And everyone in an interview setting is trying to be their best selves, and so we sort of want to dig a little bit deeper than that. Number three, describe a time when you've had to collaborate with team members in order to achieve a challenging goal. That is a pretty decent behavioral interview question. It's asking them to paint a picture for you, a story of when they've dealt with something challenging and had to work with others. This is not it, though, and I'll talk to you about how you follow up on a question like that to really get the most out of it. Number four, on a scale of 1 to 10, how assertive are you and why? Again, this is one where everybody wants to be a 10 or at least an 8 or a 9. And it's easy to come up with some sort of points in my favor to support the 8 or 9, but is that really reality? Only the behavioral examples really help with that. So I probably would change that to more of a behavioral question. Number 5, tell me about a mistake or failure that taught you a significant lesson. That's actually a really great behavioral interview question. And this one, you can get at things like self-awareness, resilience, their ability to learn, some really interesting things, and potentially some very important competencies or values for your organization. So there's probably some common areas to explore in terms of behavioral questions, because there are some commonalities across companies in terms of their culture and what competencies are key. And I've listed some of them here, and some of them might be of more interest to you if you think about your culture. So innovative. One of the questions I might use that's a behavioral interview question would be, tell us about a situation that highlights your ability to think creatively in order to overcome a challenge or meet a need. So you're having them think back through a time where they really had to come up with something creative and it helped the business in some way. Flexibility or openness to change. You might ask a question like, describe a significant change you faced in the past 2 years, and how did you handle it? If your company is very results-oriented, very focused on the bottom line, maybe you ask a question like, tell us about a time when you had to make a difficult business decision under stressful circumstances. And if you're looking for someone who is really resilient and positive, perhaps it's a call center company that needs employees to be able to bounce back and stay positive despite many hang-ups and challenges, you might ask them something like this. Describe a challenge you faced that taught you something important, and have them walk through that challenge. If you're looking for somebody who's really assertive, really willing to challenge, maybe you ask them a question like, so tell us about a time when it took courage for you to speak up about an issue or concern, and see sort of what example they come up with. And finally, if you're looking for someone who's very team-oriented, very collaborative, maybe you ask them to describe a time when you were able to partner with a person or group who had a very different goal or approach than you did. So you're trying to get at, what's an example where it wasn't easy, but they were able to really use their skills to collaborate and interpersonally connect with that other team and get something done, or that other group. So there's plenty of examples. I could brainstorm with you all day on different questions for different areas, and we've created a number of them for many clients. But the thing you have to know is that once you've asked that behavioral question, the follow-up is key. That's where you make sure that the candidate gives you the meat and enough of an answer to properly evaluate them. So for every question that you ask, you might actually identify specific follow-up questions or probe questions. So what were the circumstances? What were the risks? So here are examples of some you might use. And what part of it were you responsible for yourself? Okay, and what were the challenges or hiccups that came up throughout the process? Okay, and what did you learn from that? What would you do differently if you had to do it again? So here you're really just getting as much as you can. And you'll find that if a candidate has decided to make up an answer to their question, to your question, that it's a lot harder for them once you start asking these follow-up questions for them to really maintain their focus and line of thought, and sometimes they will unravel. In some cases it's because they've totally made it up. If they haven't, they're going to have some answers for you, and you're going to be able to explore this a little bit more. So once you've asked the question, you've asked the follow-up, you've got to figure out how you're going to evaluate this. In many cases, we recommend creating scoring guides for the behavioral interview questions, where you have an idea of what does it look like if someone was effectively doing something effective in this area or ineffective. And you can actually, might think of asking some successful people in your organization, people that you feel like really embody the culture of your organization. How would you answer this question? Or what do you think success would look like in a response to this question? What would be ineffective? So you might get some ideas from them. So personality assessment is another tool that you could use in assessing culture fit, and personality assessment can reveal certain traits or tendencies that are aligned with culture. I am not in any way suggesting that a company needs to hire a bunch of individuals all with the same personality. In fact, that might create a problem. But I think if you focus on what's really critical to your culture, maybe assertiveness, maybe openness to change, maybe discipline or attention to detail, or sort of a willingness to collaborate, those things you can look at certain personality traits and sort of know whether they're going to be in that ballpark or not, or whether they're going to have some issues that might get in the way of those things. But it's really best to have a professional handle this aspect of things, maybe do an assessment for you or whatnot, and that can help provide another layer of very helpful information to inform your decision. A culture profile is when you use a personality assessment, but you basically, we've worked with many clients to create one of these. You look at what is successful in a specific organizational culture. We look at the high performers, or those that model the desired culture, and we see how they differ from the low performers, or those who are a poor culture fit. And that gives us an idea of what traits and characteristics drive success in that culture. So that sort of shows you where, when you have the candidate come in and you have them take the same test, we can show you where does that individual differ, or where are they similar to the cultural ideal on certain traits. And then you can also use that information to focus or follow up more on some of the areas that are of concern, and ask the right interview questions to learn more. Okay, so once the interview is done, and whew, that was a lot of work, that interview, right? We had lots of people interviewing, we had to get them all aligned, we had to make sure we were asking the right questions. The next thing we have to do is make sure that we handle the debriefing well, that we gather all the data possible from this process, and that we make a really good decision and communicate with them well, and sort of use that information if we decide to hire them to onboard them properly. Now, the debriefing and gathering data, you want to make sure that, I think as I alluded to before, make sure that you create more of an organized process. If you have 5 people in the room to discuss an individual, you also want to make sure as a facilitator that one person's opinions are not drowning out the others, that everyone has a chance to weigh in, and that you objectively go through some of the needs, requirements, and competencies, and talk about sort of the pros and cons for each. You also want to make sure that you're gathering all the data together, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the unusual data that you might consider. And communicating with the candidate, you have to think about how are you going to share the results of the decision with the candidate. And that can be very powerful in terms of communicating your brand and what it's like to be at your company. So this next slide I have for you, I found online at glassdoor.com. And this is from an individual who interviewed with Twitter and did not get the job, funnily enough, but wrote this review about the interview process. He or she said, "This was by far one of the best interview experiences that I've ever had. The recruiter was kind, helpful, always available to answer my questions. After my phone screen, I had a phone interview with one of the hiring managers, and then 2 rounds of in-person interviews. The process was seamless and even fun. The team itself was top-notch. At the end of the day, I was told that my feedback was all positive, but the hiring manager chose to hire someone else based on preference. I truly appreciate that they were willing to provide feedback. I'd consider interviewing for another opportunity at Twitter simply based on the recruiting process." So here's something to think about. First of all, they didn't get the job, but they got a little bit of feedback. Did the hiring manager give them all the negative feedback and maybe all the real reasons? Not necessarily, but they got some feedback, and that was in some way showing the candidate that their time was valued and that their willingness to apply and make the effort was valued. And I think this shows Twitter's ability to really promote their brand throughout the entire process. For someone to come away from a job interview where they did not get the job and to say, hey, that was fun, it was seamless, clearly it was organized, they loved the team, so clearly they were able to meet a number of the team members and really get a sense for them. And now that person walks away with a feeling of, wow, Twitter's a great company, it's somewhere I'd love to work, and I'm going to recommend it to friends that have opportunities, and if I have another chance at it, I'm going to take it. So know that the experience that you create throughout the interview process is either promoting or damaging your brand, and if you don't pay careful enough attention, you could be doing the latter. So some data to consider as you are evaluating the candidates in the end. How did they treat other people? So it might sound silly, but when they walked in that front lobby, how did they greet the person at the front desk? Were they rude? Were they short? Were they 10 minutes late? Did they seem completely discombobulated? All of those things do matter. Were they able to connect over lunch or with each interviewer? Were they able to relate to that person and somehow be comfortable in the interview process? Did they ask questions, or were they just bumps on a log through the process? Did their style match the culture? You got to be a little careful with this one, but here's just a very simple example. If you were in Silicon Valley at a startup and you're interviewing folks, and someone walks in a 3-piece suit and then their hair in a bun, there's an immediate mismatch between the style that's going on in the rest of the company and this person who's just walked in. And little things like that can be very telling about the person's awareness of your organization and their willingness to make adaptations and their ability to fit in. So you've got to think through that. And I have Southwest Airlines here because they actually they pay attention to all sorts of data. And I read a story about how when they interview people, they fly them on Southwest Airlines, of course, to their headquarters. And after they've flown in and then flown home, they actually ask the gate agents and the flight attendants to weigh in and provide any feedback on this individual and what they were like as they were traveling to and from the interview. So you never know. If you're on the other side of this thing, if you're a candidate, you never know when somebody's watching. Big Brother is out there, and if you're an interviewer or a hiring manager, all of those things play a role in who this person really is. So pay attention to every bit of data you can find. So what are some red flags that there's a poor culture fit? How do you know that it's not going to be a match? Let's say, for example, that you hire someone who's a change agent in a conservative company. So I interviewed someone for a company once. It was a very conservative company, lots of bureaucracy. Change happened very slowly. You had to go through all sorts of channels. And you had to also be there a long time before people gave you any respect and before you had any credibility to really lead any major change. And so this person who is coming in or hoping to come into the company at a high-level role was a mover and a shaker. He loved change, was, probably over-enthusiastic about it, was sort of risky to some extent. Clearly a poor cultural fit. He would have just caused all sorts of problems had he gone into that culture. Then you have the example of someone who's very independent, very competitive, or maybe even the big ego who goes into a collaborative culture. And that's going to create a lot of bad feelings and waves in a culture where teamwork and humbleness is important, or humility rather. And lastly, let's say you have someone who's very results oriented, or who really feels like they need to adhere to a hierarchy. Hierarchy means something very important to them. And you dump them into a flat organization where anyone has the CEO's ear and, people sort of wear different hats. They might have a little bit of trouble with that. Or, for example, if you have an introvert who ends up in an organization where you only have open plan offices and they're expected to talk all the time on the phone when they know that their neighbor's listening in, they might have a hard time with that. That's an example of a poor fit or a strain. Someone who's a bit more of an extrovert might have a more positive cultural fit. All right, so those are some examples of red flags, but I'm sure there's a lot more out there that exist. So just as a sort of note of warning, hiring for culture fit is not a way to make discrimination sound palatable, and I would not want anyone to use cultural fit as an excuse for sort of feelings that interviewers aren't comfortable expressing. What you need to do is use culture fit effectively by doing the work on the front end to really define what's important to your culture and then objectively evaluate it, so that you can make some more clear decisions and have more clear answers as to why or why not someone was a culture fit. Unfortunately, it takes a little bit of work on the front end to be able to do that right, but I think once you do, you can get to a place where you're hiring people that can dive into that pool gracefully without much of a ripple versus the belly flop. So everybody, we're at the end here, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have. Hope that was helpful. I know we covered a lot in a pretty short period of time, and I do appreciate you all putting up with the technical glitches that we had in the front end. So let's see. I know my colleague Dina is kind of trying to see what some of your questions are. Okay, so I think one of the questions was, gosh, we have a lot of change in our culture. How do we hire someone to fit in our culture even though it's constantly changing? That's a really good question. Because you have to evaluate it and know whether or not is your culture changing from something it is now to something you all want it to be. And so should you be evaluating the candidates based on what the ideal culture is that you're creating? Or is it simply that part of your culture and being successful in your culture is being flexible and amenable to change and open, and you can assess for those things. So you have to sort of know what aspect of the change is it. We're changing into a different culture, or our culture is just lots of change, and so we're looking, part of the ideal or competency is flexibility and adaptability. Another question we have here is, how do I convince my boss to focus on culture? She's extremely focused on getting someone who has specific experience. Okay, so that one, I would say, hopefully I presented some statistics up front in this presentation that you'll have access to. Specifically, looks like slide number 9 would be helpful for you on that front. But really, and you can quote Tony, I don't know how you pronounce his last name, for the CEO of Zappos, pretty successful big company that has made the choice to overlook people that are just star performers in the favor of culture fit. But culture fit has a huge impact on so many things, productivity, retention, engagement, all those things. So I think it's certainly worth looking at that. And my recommendation actually is, let's say you have an employee or a candidate who is pretty good in terms of the sort of skill set or proficiencies, and they're excellent in terms of culture fit, versus someone who is a star and not a culture fit. I would go for candidate A over candidate B any day. The last question we have here is, okay, we think we hired someone who's a culture fit, but how do we really make sure that this person understands and adjusts to our culture and really adapts? Okay, so there's where we start getting into the importance of training and the importance of making sure that everybody goes through a training that helps them establish a common language and a common sort of experience for what that culture is. And there are companies like Google, like Zappos, things like that, that do a very intensive, 2 to 4 week training. In fact, at Zappos, they go through a 4-week training program. They go over the company history, the importance of customer service, the vision for the company, the philosophy about the culture, and then they take calls from customers and whatnot. And at the end of that training, they give people that they've just hired, recent hires, the chance to leave after being given a stipend or to stay. So that's actually a chance to even reinforce, okay, now you've learned even more about our culture. Is this you or is this not you? And so, yeah, I think if you really want to make sure that a person is a culture fit, and then you really want to integrate them in the culture, you have to make sure that your training up front, your onboarding process, is well organized and includes all those things to help that person really know what works in your culture. And we certainly help clients do that as well. So I hope you all have enjoyed today's webinar. We'll be sending, as Gina mentioned, out a copy of the presentation and whatnot. And if you have any questions, we're certainly happy to help and explore some of the challenges that you all have individually with your organizational cultures and with getting the right people on board. So have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone, so very much. We appreciate your patience earlier this morning. We will be following up with a copy of your presentation and a recording of this webinar for your reference. You should receive it within the next business day or so in your email. And please don't hesitate to reach out with any additional questions we weren't able to get to for the sake of time today. But thank you all very much.
Take care.